The current wearables that we see, Wearables 1.0, is like a hard device, like it's a smartwatch, a smart ring, or any other device, and it has a relatively hard shell. But Wearables 2.0 is really looking at softer electronics and skin conformable devices. So things that kind of like stick on like a patch on your skin, and then it can already measure kind of things.
If you see us producing more YouTube videos, it's because we hire editors, and that's made possible by the revenue from our lab's testing services. This includes something we are increasingly known for, strength testing, but also other tests like VO2 max tests and testing for muscle oxygenation levels. Some of these clients go on to do personal training with us, and we learn from the domain specialists that we feature on this channel how we can provide even better training and testing services to them. In a way, it is a continuous loop of learning, improvement, and better service. This has even progressed to a stage whereby we are running courses for fellow physios and trainers approved by the relevant regulatory bodies with, for example, Dr. Danny Lam, and in the future, other guests as well. If you'd like to see more content, receive better services, and enjoy them at a grandfathered rate, please feel free to reach out to us today to see how we can help you with your healthy aging journey. With that, back to the episode. Hi, Jessica.
Hello.
Welcome onto the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
So I approached you because to do a video review, for example, on devices is one matter, but to do a paper altogether is another different thing, right? I'm just curious, what got you inspired?
Yeah, so this paper is actually part of a series of papers, and we didn't really plan to write this paper in the beginning. So our main kind of problem we wanted to solve was we wanted to find a device to use in our clinical studies. And our studies are looking at interventions to lower your biological age over like an X number of months. But we wanted to also be able to monitor other kind of parameters or other metrics of the participants outside of these visits. So the thing that we thought of is probably a wearable device, but because there are so many out there, we were like, okay, which ones do we choose? We don't know which ones to choose. So it actually started from a systematic review, which is a type of evidence gathering in the medical sciences or any type of sciences, where a group of, researchers, they would use a search to kind of pull all the relevant studies or trials that are looking at their topic of interest, and then they would kind of compile all that information and see what's out there. So that's kind of how it started. We did a systematic review for all the possible remote monitoring technologies that have been used and published about, and this for measuring cardiovascular functions. So then after we had that list of 216, we were like, okay, then how do we choose? Like, there's just a bunch of devices. So that's how the second paper came about, which was a practical guide for selecting wearable devices. And it kind of brings you through all the steps that you likely would encounter when choosing a wearable device. And that's kind of how the current paper that we're talking about came about, is because we had a list of devices and we had kind of like a recipe to follow for how to choose a device. And then the product of that was the paper you saw, where we kind of have all the devices that we kind of reviewed based on those criteria.
So would you say this paper is mainly aimed at researchers, or is something that the average person can take up and read and find useful?
So we wrote the paper as an example for our context of use, which is we wanted to pick a device that could be used in everyday people like you and me who are participating in the clinical studies. That being said, the way that we designed it to pick a device, it was kind of designed to help anybody from researchers to healthcare professionals to even like consumers like you and me. And the reason for that is we feel like this question would be pretty common in the next few years, and people want to know how to best choose something that works for them. So we wanted to really design a kind of a multifunctional kind of recipe or guide. So there are varying levels of complexity to it. And I guess for like researchers and healthcare professionals, there may be more parameters or criteria to think about. And then for consumers, there may be like less consideration. For example, like data management in the clinical setting, like capturing all that data is something that you and I may not need in our everyday lives, but for a clinical research team, that's really important.
Yeah, I think we'll go into that later.
Yeah.
I just want to find out for now, what are the steps to select a wearable device? in your studies, and what was the thinking behind it?
Yeah, so I guess from a consumer point of view, I think the most important thing we wanted to know was why you want to measure, like what do you want to measure first, and then why you want to measure it, and then how would it actually fit into your lifestyle when you're measuring it? Because if you don't use the device, then you probably won't get any reliable data, and then you would also want to think about like how long would you be wanting to collect this data. So that is sort of like the four main big questions I would ask when choosing a wearable device. But for like the actual paper, it's a more complex and structured version of it for like researchers and healthcare professionals.
Yeah, you went from more than 200 devices onto a small number of devices.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So for this is the more complex part that maybe you and I don't need to kind of go through. But let's say for a clinical research team, it's important to know that, for example, if you want to measure a patient or a participant regularly and continuously, you need something that can be good for continuous monitoring. And then our other criteria was whether the device was available and suitable. So for example, if you have a device that was discontinued or the model's not produced anymore, then it's a bit hard to kind of get new insights and updates from it. So that's why we also remove those that were not available. And whether it's suitable or not, we also look at. So for example, there are fetal monitors for mothers that they can wear on their stomach that can measure cardiovascular functions. And that is a remote monitoring, it's a wearable device. But I guess if we're not pregnant and we're not, female and then we wouldn't wear it, right? So it's not suitable even though it fits the continuous monitoring and availability part. And then our third criteria was the technical performance of the device. So are the measurements that we're looking at, are they accurate and precise? And the fourth criteria is the feasibility parameters, which is like how feasible is it to use in everyday life and in a clinical and research setting. And then that's where we split the criteria into kind of two categories. The first is user experience, so everything from usability and acceptability. And then we also look at the usage in research and clinics. So that's more of like a data management perspective, a logistics perspective that maybe the everyday consumer wouldn't need to think about, but for like a research team is really important. And then the last thing, of course, we look at cost, because depending on budgetary constraints or any restrictions, cost is very important to keep in mind as well when choosing the device.
Yeah, I saw in your paper the cost of the devices really ranged.
It does. I think it's also to keep in mind that those costs I tried my best to kind of standardize them so you can look at it as like a per unit of device costs. But of course, for consumers, that it might not be as important of a thing to think about is like the other costs that are related. So let's say for research, you may also think about like a user management system, so software behind the device to kind of collect all your participants' data and kind of store it somewhere. So that's also another cost that the manufacturers sometimes provide. Another thing could be like accessories. I guess like as smartwatch users, like maybe the straps are like accessories, things like that. But I guess for a clinical study, there would be even more costs such as like replacement parts or anything. So those were also the costs that I didn't include in that column because it was just very varied between the devices. But overall, like what can you expect from like one unit of the device, just for the device alone?
Talking about variation, you measure quite a few metrics as well, or use them to gauge the devices.
Yeah.
What's the thinking behind I need to find out the gold standard for a certain metric and then compare it to the devices?
Exactly. So one of the main things that we talk about on our team is that if we measure something, how do we know that we can trust it? How do we know that it's accurate, right? And in medicine and science, there is something that's called like a gold standard device or gold standard measurement. And it's the best possible instrument that we know that can give us a very accurate, like as close to like what's happening in a real case scenario. So with the kind of smart wearables nowadays, they try to measure the same measurements that these instruments measure, but we don't always know if they kind of reflect the same kind of values that are being measured. So during this process, we were thinking that, okay, if we want to have accurate and reliable measurements, so then we can, kind of understand our results from and kind of interpret and, think of the future research questions or like anything we want to solve, then we want a device that can give us accurate and reliable measurements that we could, use in lieu of like a gold standard measurement. So that's why it was also really important for us to kind of see that were there any teams out there that have done, we call it validation testing. So whether they've taken the device and then they've compared it with a gold standard measurement to see, whether it matches up the values and everything.
Did you have to conduct any studies yourself to validate this?
Yeah, so for the scope of this study, unfortunately, I didn't get to do that. It would have been very fun to kind of do the measurements and see the multiple measurements to see like whether it kind of matched up to the gold standard instrument. And unfortunately, we don't have the facilities to do that because, for example, for like heart rate measurement, the gold standard would be a 12-lead ECG, but not every clinic, maybe not every research team, lab team would have it. So the thought process behind this paper is that, hey, like for a research team that doesn't have the facilities to do this gold standard measurement, how else can they kind of verify whether the device they want to choose is accurate or not? And the next best option is to look at peer-reviewed papers. So these are papers that have been published after being reviewed by other experts in the field, and then they've been published. So looking at those papers to see whether independent third-party groups have kind of looked at the accuracy and reliability of that device against like a gold standard instrument.
So looking at all these papers while writing your own,
Yeah.
right? What are some conceptions that you had and you realized weren't true?
Yeah, I realize this might be different for everybody, and my thoughts on this could change in the future. But when I was looking at all these devices, I realized that the newest one, the most expensive one, and the ones with the most measurements may not always be the best one to kind of use for in that context that you're looking for.
So how can we trust the device, or how do we know whether we can trust the device?
Yeah, and I think the first thing to think about is like really the question like, what do you want to measure and why do you want to measure it? Because what you want to measure will kind of let you know what specific measurements to look for. And if the device doesn't have that measurement, then there's no point getting that, right? And then the second thing is I think you were asking about like trusting the values. So this kind of depends on the context of why you're measuring this kind of measure. So if let's say I have diabetes, I need to keep my glucose levels within a certain range, right? That means that the device that I use needs to have a very accurate and reliable reading for me to know whether I am staying within range of my glucose levels. Whereas I would say like maybe for the general public who may be relatively healthy and wouldn't have diabetes, maybe for them like a slight, I guess, maybe a 1 or 2 unit, maybe 0.1, 0.2 unit difference wouldn't make a big kind of change to what you do in your everyday lifestyle. But I think if you think about like somebody, even like another example would be someone who has heart failure or cardiovascular disease, is very important whether they know maybe if they have a heart arrhythmia or potential heart arrhythmia as early as possible, right, to get medical help. But maybe for you and I, if we're quite healthy and active, maybe it's something that we don't need to worry too much about. So in the sense that can we trust it, I would usually want to see validation studies that they're accurate and then maybe I can trust it. But if I don't find any, then I would also be looking at the trend of like how the measurements change. If there's like a very like large variation and drop, I don't know, maybe it's not really the real true value that you're getting in the device. But if you see that like over maybe 1 to 2 weeks, those measurements kind of fluctuate around like a narrow range, it probably means that's your like baseline or regular everyday value.
So for the layperson reading these validation studies, is there anything we should look out for?
I would look at, let's say in the validation studies, there are probably a few parts. There's like introduction, the methods, result, and then the discussion. Usually in the discussion, the first paragraph, and maybe somewhere in like the last paragraph, it would kind of give you a good summary of how the device is working and like whether it's accurate or precise or not. And then you can kind of look at that to kind of gauge whether the device is dependable or reliable. That's like for the more in-depth look. Otherwise, you can also look at the abstract to see what the values are, to see if it's kind of within range. Usually the paper would interpret it as well sometimes in the discussion or the abstract, so you can kind of understand whether those values are acceptable.
Does the number of people in the study matter?
It does, in the sense that the more people you have, the more power or like the more true the results might be. But one caveat to kind of know is that for these validation studies, it's not always easy to get enough people to do the testing, to do the trials and everything. So I would kind of look at the values. I would look at the results and the number of people together to kind of see whether you can trust.
Okay, so
Yeah,
how would someone choose between Apple, Garmin, or a Fitbit? The whole range of possible options out there?
Yeah, so I think earlier I mentioned already that the highest cost device and like the most effective version may not be like the best one for you. So it could be like best can be relative, right? Like best in what context. So that's why in kind of the blog I wrote more on the paper and for like the everyday audiences to read, there are 4 questions that I would recommend people to ask themselves when they want to choose a device. And the first thing is really like, what do you want to measure? Like have a list of all the measurements that you're interested in or that you may be curious about measuring. And then to also really ask, like, why are you measuring this? Like, is it for changing lifestyle habits? Is it for kind of tracking and making sure that you stay like within a range of values? Or is it more for like a understanding your body more type of reason? And then it's important to ask like how and when will you measure it? So for example, if I wanted to improve my sleep, I would want to get a device that can measure sleep well and kind of let me know like insights on my sleep. Now for the device, maybe I want to wear it every day, but maybe I also just want to wear it when I sleep, right? So then knowing when and how you want to wear it also kind of determines what the form factor is, so like what kind of shape the device takes. And then the last question I would recommend people think about is like, how long do you want to measure this? Like, is it like a long-term lifestyle kind of change you want to add to your routines, or is it more like a maybe my doctor recommended that I go exercise more these to maybe lower my blood pressure. Then okay, maybe until your next doctor's visit, you really want to make sure that you do enough exercise every day. Then maybe you can use a wearable device to kind of keep track of that.
Have you came across any research that showed wearing wearable device actually helps the person's health?
Yeah, so I actually did look at some papers yesterday to answer this question, and there was a systematic review, like we mentioned before, is the collection of all studies for the topic that we're interested in, which is does wearing wearable devices improve health outcomes? So they said that it has been used for, because long term for things like diabetes, Parkinson's disease, chronic lower back pain, etc. And 50% of the studies did show a positive influence on the outcome that they study. And then 50% did show nil effect. So what this kind of shows us, and what the paper kind of showed, is that wearable devices are still relatively new. If you think about it, when did the first Apple Watch come out again? Do you remember? Maybe like
No idea.
2014, 15.
A decade
I
plus
could be
minus,
wrong.
yeah.
Maybe a decade. So, and then the timeline for a lot of research studies is maybe 2 years, 3 years, and then in order to analyze the data and publish it, maybe takes another 1 to 2 years. So you think about it, like the devices came out 10 years ago. We've started getting data and learning more about it 5 years ago. So it's still quite new. There's a lot of potential for sure, and I think if we kind of utilize it to its maximum potential and utilize it in a way that's beneficial and appropriate, I think it could give us a lot of benefits. But I think right now we're still like looking at the data that's coming out.
What other exciting things are coming out of wearable devices?
Yeah, so this is something that I learned about at a engineering conference, and I think is super cool for everyone to know. So now there's something called Wearables 2.0. So the current wearables that we see, Wearables 1.0, is like I guess a hard device, like it's a smartwatch, a smart ring, or any other device, and it has a relatively hard shell. But Wearables 2.0 is really looking at softer electronics and skin conformable devices. So things that kind of like stick on like a patch on your skin, and then it can already measure kind of things. So then it's still, a lot of these things are still in research and development. So we maybe won't get it commercially anytime soon, but it's probably like the next really interesting frontier in wearables.
Would you say these sort of wearables would also become something commonly used in the medical setting?
It also depends for what purposes, I think. There are devices that are already medical grade for measuring. So a lot of, let's say, for example, FDA-approved medical devices, a selection of them are already remote monitoring technology. Like people in the hospitals or for like clinical and medical care, they would already wear it and they'd be capturing all these kind of measurements. So in a sense, like these wearable devices are already in medical and clinical care. But I think what we've seen more these days come out is a lot of consumer wearable devices with a lot more variety, maybe a lot of like different measurements and different kind of insights that we get that's paired with a mobile application. These ones are not registered as medical devices. And whether they can be used as a medical device, I feel like they would still need to go through the kind of process to certify them as a medical device. So I'm not a physician or a doctor, so I can't speak on their behalf, but I feel like wearable devices can kind of be complementary to clinical visits. So of course you need to have maybe like go see your doctor for any more serious kind of health conditions, or let's say for like annual checkups, you still need to like go there for blood tests and maybe measure blood pressure with like the device at the doctor's. But maybe they can also like kind of learn from the wearable data that you have, like, oh, have you been exercising regularly? What's your heart rate and heart rate variability like throughout these last few years? Like, are you feeling stressed, anxious? Like, it won't replace any medical testing or assessments, but it can definitely like kind of fill in the gaps a bit more, fill in the picture for your doctor about your lifestyle and your habits.
What's one thing that you wish people knew more about a wearable device that they perhaps don't?
The thing that I hear a lot from people is that they sometimes looking at the measurements on the wearable device is they say that it makes them feel more stressed and anxious because they're always making sure that they're, getting the X number of steps or like getting, hitting all the check marks, right, that their wearable tells them. And I think my understanding and kind of knowledge of wearable devices is that it ideally should be helping you in your everyday life and should be making your life better. So if it kind of brings you kind of stress or more anxiety, then maybe it's not working in a way that's helpful for you. And in that sense, I think it's always okay to like stop wearing the device if it's not, let's say, medically necessary as deemed by your doctor, just to monitor your heart rate, for example. So I think once the device starts not giving you the benefits that you wanted to, I think it's okay to maybe switch to a different device or to even not wear the device. And I think a lot of people nowadays are like, you should wear this next wearable device. It's so cool. You should always be tracking yourself. And yeah, it is true. Like you can only change what you're measuring and you can only improve if you're tracking it. But I think it's also important to kind of check in like with yourself too, like whether this is actually helping you before kind of just pushing through and continuing to measure.
Cool. With that, I think that's most of the questions I wanted to ask. Do you have anything else you want to add?
No, I think that's it. I think if anybody has more questions, they can always find me on my blog or they can reach out to me through LinkedIn or anything.
Cool.
Yeah.
With that, we've come to the end of this episode. See you next time. Take care.
Thank you.